Hello, everyone. Welcome to another one-on-one on Talking Feds. I'm Harry Littman. The January 6th melee was first presented to us was already the biggest set of cases in DOJ history, and they are still trying to find some of the offenders and the like. The focus to date with all the zeroing in on Donald Trump has been, did this delay the actual ability to get at him? Are we now flirting with not having this in the election as a result? But people tend to forget the huge importance of these cases in their own right. And that's why I was very happy to have the chance to talk to Ryan Reilly, who is with us today. He's a justice reporter for NBC News. You've probably seen him on TV, but he's the author of a new book entitled Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System. So he gives us now a focus on everything other than the Trump stuff from January 6th, and it's quite a story. Ryan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's just start with where we are, because it's ceased to be sort of daily news. What's the latest in the cases? What's the kind of overall numbers? We know there have been some very big ticket prosecutions involving, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. Are there big ones still in the offing? Just, what's the landscape?
Sure. So right now there's more than 1,250 people who have been charged, but honestly, that's not even really almost less than about a third of what could theoretically be charged. Now, they're not going to get to that number because, there's only less than 2 years, 23 months left on the statute of limitations. But in reality, the number of people who could have been charged for either entering the Capitol or committing some sort of violence outside was north of 3,000. So really, I think it's,
wow. And now a lot of those, they decided not to, and I think the judges had early meetings. You can't bring us all these cases prosecuted.
So that's actually,
but some of them they just haven't found still. Yeah.
So it's actually that number, even the 3,000 one, that actually is more of the operational number who could right. So I think the ones that they couldn't charge are the ones who are outside, right. Then you're talking about 15,000, nonsense numbers. You're never going to get.
Okay.
But the people who went inside is more than 3,000, and overall those cases have held up. There was
more than 3,000 entered the Capitol.
That's correct. Yeah, which shocks
and
a lot.
And there were 15,000 all around. Just everyone take a second to envision that. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that total number, the sleuths have really gotten into this and got they're right at 3,400 insiders right now, individuals who identified going inside, and the sleuths have really kind of been ahead of this because the number is ticked up slowly as more video footage has come up, but it was at 2,500 is what the feds were estimating. I think basically a year into this prosecution, that's the number that they sort of landed on, and actually the number gets really into the weeds, but the number that they used to calculate how much in damages individuals would have to pay. So they basically took, here's how much the damages, divided it by 2,000 or 2,500, and then that's what they broke it down to per individual defendant. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge spectrum of people, and a lot of them have already been identified by sleuths, but have not yet been arrested for a pretty wide variety of reasons that I sort of try to get at in the book there.
Wow. Okay. And so right now, how many are awaiting trial?
They've basically kept a steady pace of 500 sort of open cases, right? So 900 have been convicted, but you think of open cases in terms of even people who still have to wait to be sentenced. So between the people who either haven't gone to trial or haven't been sentenced yet, that's roughly around 500, but they've secured, 900 convictions. So really, you're talking about 350 or something like that who haven't actually been convicted yet is basically the numbers that they're working with. But last week, for example, there were 12 new cases brought, and that was that was definitely an uptick from what we've seen recently, especially if you factor in the end of the year when there's sort of a little bit of a slowdown for sure. Those were significant numbers, and if they were to keep up that pace, you can easily see them surpassing certainly the 2,000 mark, and perhaps going from there. I mean, I think the 2,000 is sort of like the baseline for what the slews would maybe be satisfied with, and maybe like what the U.S. Attorney's Office has communicated to the judges that the total scope of this could be around 2,000 in the end. So that's sort of, I think, that magic number that they're sort of working towards, which would mean 700 and 700 and change of these cases left to go if they've got 1,250 at this point.
And do we think there are any really serious actors of the Stewart Rhodes or, close to level that so far have not been dealt with? Or does the big harvest they've had to date include all the most serious miscreants?
I think in terms of the criminal conspiracy cases, in terms of groups, certainly we've seen that thus far. There have been like a little smaller one-offs with sort of organizations where they've, wrapped up some 3%ers who are all going together, essentially two different cases, one from California, and another group of sort of 3%ers, a lot of whom were from Florida, that those cases sort of proceeded, but, didn't get all that much press attention. But I think in terms of the criminal conspiracies involving multiple defendants, certainly we've already seen the biggest cases, but there are a lot of really violent defendants who have been identified who still haven't been arrested. And, the slews really are just playing a tremendous role in this investigation that is really, I think, unlike anything that we've seen in modern history. Because frankly,
who are the slews?
Yeah.
What do you?
So the slews online Sedition Hunters, who, as they branded themselves, who have basically collected as much video evidence as you could possibly imagine from January 6th, any kind of evidence, video, photo evidence, and use that to identify a lot of individuals who stormed the Capitol. So even
These are private actors, right?
Private actors, yeah. Now, some of them, have we've seen in court paperwork and FBI affidavits, have now established sort of like relationships with the FBI, but especially in the early days, this was, very much sort of like. This was not AstroTurf. This was a ground, this was a real movement that people sort of got together on Twitter for the most part, and organized around this. A lot of Americans from across the country, a couple of
patriots mainly. What's their motivation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I get at the book is, you think of this as just being, a bunch of Democrats getting together, but no, actually, one of the people who played a really key role here voted for Trump twice and just was outraged about what he saw that day, and really thought that this was, a stain on our country, an attack on democracy, and that those individuals needed to be held accountable for their actions, and really has played this tremendous role, I think, along with these other slews in bringing these individuals to justice. And I think, what's interesting now is they've also sort of pivoted towards putting pressure on the FBI and the Justice Department to bring these cases. When someone will pop up, for example, there was a presentation that the U.S. Attorney gave on the 3-year anniversary, and there was an individual whose photo was featured in there who they turned in, 2 years ago, right? So they started drumming up after that. Okay, where's this case, right? We gave you this name so long ago. Where is this case? Lo and behold, a couple of weeks ago, this individual was ultimately arrested. So it's this weird thing, for me, having covered the Justice Department, to be in front of investigations to a certain extent, where like I have a list of hundreds of these names of people who haven't been arrested yet. But that's sort of where we are with, I think, the technology and what slews have been able to do in terms of identifying these folks.
And I can say, from having been in the Justice Department, somebody brings a name like that and sort of embarrassed what's been going on for 2 years.
Yeah.
An order goes out to try to find. Okay, so that just really sets the table for the book, The Sedition Hunters. I mean, which is, you really focus and do a whole kind of analysis of what gave rise to this, where these 3,000 kind of came from, what they are as a social movement, etc. So maybe we should start with what are the Sedition Hunters, but let's zero in now on the book itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so one thing I think that, was a little bit of not was what I was anticipating with the book, and I think it's frankly because of what the January 6th committee ultimately did in terms of their focus on Trump and sort of leaving a lot of this sort of raw material out there for journalists like myself to go through. Was I really ended up focusing on a lot of the lead up to January 6th because there was just a lot of raw material that the committee put together that I thought was just like really great to dig into and look at and try to figure out what exactly went wrong here. Because I do think that, beyond Trump, there are a lot of troubling issues that were raised by January.
I'm sorry, Ron. What went wrong on January 6th occurred, or what went wrong in the investigation and apprehension?
Mostly in the lead up to January 6th, I think is.
Sorry, go ahead.
So, yeah. So, and like, I think that was something that I ended up focusing more time in the book on than I initially had anticipated. And, because I expected when I sort of thought about this book and when I sort of, signed the deal that we would have had some of those answers, right? Exactly what went wrong. There was this January 6th committee in the works that was supposed to look at that, but they ended up really pivoting from sort of looking at the failures of law enforcement. And I think really kind of gave the FBI a pass and gave a lot of law enforcement agencies a pass about what happened here. And to me, that's really something that, as a journalist and as an American, I think is really important to figure out because this was just such an obvious thing that a lot of people saw bubbling up, and yet there were not steps taken to make sure that the Capitol was as protected as it needed to be. And I think a lot of it was because of the focus on sort of the lone wolf approach that we've taken to domestic terrorism. And certainly this was somewhat of a unique event. But just like not seeing the mob and the numbers as the threat that they could be, generally because I think of the makeup of the crowd and the population of the crowd and the thought that, this is a right-wing movement, they're back the blue generally, really sort of fed into that. And just sort of bureaucratic mess, honestly, was a lot of it, including expiration of a social media monitoring tool that the FBI used, 6 days before Capitol attack. Some procurement office within the FBI had put up an offering and someone undercut them. So then they were switching from one tool to the other a few days before the attack. And all of a sudden their entire system is down and not tracking all of this violent rhetoric that was popping up on social media. So yeah, really just like a lot of different bureaucratic failures all came together. And I think also just a lot of fear about speaking plainly about the threat that was posed by this group that the former president was summoning to DC.
Yeah, that has been a theme here that in different days would have dominated the headlines, and instead it just bubbles up periodically. To this day, I mean, just literally within the last day, a identification of what seems like a glaring omission in the Mar-a-Lago search warrant papers that has to fall partly on the FBI, but real mystery about what they knew in the days leading up, and people that I respect from the law enforcement agencies have been pretty disappointed, and Chris ran across a sort of series of events. Okay, but let's focus. It's just as a human interest story. I'm a whistleblower lawyer when I still practice and used to be, and it is this like interesting position for people within a community or nevertheless calling out peers in a sense, or people they can see for misconduct. So there's some really great stories in here just about your Sedition Hunters and finding people, and the sort of, well, give us a story or two that comes out about a Sedition Hunter and flagging somebody in particular.
I mean, so one of the most fun ones, I think, which it's the one that my sister was the most interested in, who couldn't care less normally about what I usually cover, and just there's been a lot of general interest in was this sort of Bumble sting where this young woman in DC who I spoke with just basically switched her profile from liberal to conservative, switched a couple of photos that she had out on Bumble in the immediate aftermath of the attack, and just sort of went hunting, sort of set up a honeypot trap and just talked to guys, right? And guys were just sort of embarrassingly willing to just turn over info and
Yeah.
brag about themselves to this woman that they're speaking to online. So she ended up reeling in this individual who attacked police officers with a metal whip, and he's still locked up today. And in fact, recently pleaded guilty, has not yet been sentenced. But
And he
that
sort of
was
brags about it to her. What a tough guy
exactly. And
he
it's like literally she would just say, haha, then what? And he would be like, yeah, I was on the front lines. It's it's a little embarrassing, I would say, for him to just be willing to put over so much info, not really thinking that through, as I don't think a lot of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were really thinking, using their full capacities on that day. So this was another example of that sort of adding on. But I think that sort of, there were these interesting moments where individuals just sort of like went out proactively. But honestly, most of this is more absorbing a lot of the info that is being put out through all of these cases and that was put out online. So there was just this instant effort to save as much material as humanly possible from January 6th. Like they would go to a page, and before they even started looking at anything, they would archive that, make sure that video was
yeah.
backed up, saved somewhere. And I think that putting together this database, it creates this mosaic that pays off in ways that you really couldn't imagine down the road. One example that comes to mind was there was someone who was really well covered up that day, and facial recognition has been the backbone really of this probe altogether. It really gives those leads, although sleuths are careful about how they use it in terms of making sure that they always have confirming info on it before they send it in to the FBI. They're really vigorous about vetting that information. But facial recognition is really good. It's gotten a lot better than I think people
It's amazing,
recognize.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah, but like this anyway, this one individual was really well covered up, so facial recognition wasn't going to help there. But what happened at one point was someone else was videotaping and just briefly sort of went by as this individual who was very masked up was looking on their phone, and that video capture just real quick captured what he was looking at on his phone. And as it turned out, his background was the LLC of his company, right? Like that was just his company on the back there. It's like a LLC that he owned in himself. And then they like Googled that and there he was and then matched it up that way. So there's often these little things that you don't realize how it could pay off down the line. And that's why the sleuths have been really aggressive about just sort of sweeping up and vacuuming up any video evidence that they possibly can, even when it's not particularly compelling, because you don't know how it's really going to break through ultimately in the end.
Yeah. Now you referenced a recent meeting where the sleuths or the Sedition Hunters we're talking about someone from a couple years ago. This sort of, in my experience, it's one thing to get a tip from a citizen. It's another to have a huge, they might call it kind of vigilante shadow law enforcement agency doing all this, what turns out to be very important work. What's the story a little bit of how the Bureau itself and the law enforcement came to welcome this kind of loose consortium that in other instances they might be more arm's length about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it took a while to build that trust, because if you look back at the Boston Marathon bombing, that was just sort of a mess, right? You had all these bogus tips flowing in, you had a lot of bad information floating out there on Reddit. And a lot of the lessons that we sort of learned from the open source research that went into that have really been sort of applied, years down the line here, where, people just generally didn't throw out tips. There were sort of rules early on where we're not putting people's names just out there online, right? The ways typically the names came out was either because they were charged or because they worked with journalists to make sure that information was vetted. And we did some stories, myself breaking the news of who some of the individuals were in the early days. We haven't done as many of them more recently for a variety of reasons because it's been so long since. But those are ways to sort of vet that information. But there's a lot of nervousness about it, I think, still within the Bureau, even though I think that they're realizing how powerful open source information really can be here. And I think that the Bureau is still really catching up on that, recognizing how much you can put together just based on publicly available information, especially, facial recognition, a lot of these tools that can really, identify someone. I mean, I've had facial recognition run on myself, and it's really quite remarkable because
Yeah.
it'll pick up photos of me where a lot of them, frankly, were actually taken on the Hill, when I was reporting, but I'm like in the back row of a massive hearing, and it's like a wide shot of the hearing. And like, I wouldn't even, if I looked at that photo, I was scrolling through it, I would have no idea that I was even in it. But then it'll be like, zoop. One of them, I think, was actually a James Comey hearing where I'm like, it found me in the background of one, and zoop, there I am. Like, it's this little shot. And it's like, yep, that is indeed me. Right. So it can pick up a lot, and like those leads can be really beneficial. So I think that this is sort of a learning process, I think, for the FBI. And obviously there are some considerations there in terms of civil liberties and how exactly you want to be going about this, but the sleuths have really provided just a ton of value for the FBI.
Yeah, they proved their bona fides. I mean, I can tell you what the institutional view, there'd be many in the FBI. I mean, in general, FBI, doesn't welcome even other agencies that can't possibly be as good. But the concern I would have filled it as a U.S. attorney is, even though it shouldn't be the case legally, if any of it puts into potential play any kinds of moves that the sleuths did that, were they done by FBI agents, might violate the Fourth Amendment, puts them into sort of shadow deputy positions, or that would be the concern. And I'm just curious, has this come up at all? Has any defendant tried to mount a defense based on the conduct of the sleuths?
No, and I mean, I think that the sleuths this isn't like, dark web hackery, right? This is like open source material, right? So a lot of this is just, they found something using a tool that was available on the open internet. Like, now a lot of these citations are coming from other cases. So the Justice Department will release this video from another case, and then lo and behold, it shows something that the sleuths are now getting there. So like, it's all legitimate evidence. The biggest example of this was in the Proud Boys case, which was one of these ones that was really just like shocking to me, because the Proud Boys case, you had, the biggest case, arguably, I think probably even more important. I think it is more important than the Oath Keepers one even. And that was something that the FBI was working on really hard, and they were focusing on these 5 individuals. And you have this one guy on the stand, Zachary Real, this Philly Proud Boy, just leaning into, I didn't assault anyone. And the feds had never provided any evidence that he assaulted anyone. They didn't claim that he assaulted anyone. They didn't charge him directly with assaulting anyone. And then when he was sort of on the stand over this long weekend, the sleuths got to work, and they found him assaulting someone, like found something that they had missed. And
the sleuths got to work.
Yeah. And like, it was literally because over this long weekend, they were getting irritated with watching the live coverage of this. And then like, him denying, no. And then like, he just fell apart on the stand, right? It's like, obviously him. In fact, subsequently
they confronted him with it on the stand. And so were you there? What a dramatic moment.
It was really dramatic because, like, you have him on the stand, and like, just having presented, like, and the government turned it over as soon as they the next day they turned it over. Right. As soon as they got it, like, here it is. And then, he suddenly has to pivot. And then like, he ultimately did when asked if he, pepper sprayed or assaulted anyone. And then he ultimately pivoted to, I do not recall. Right. And he didn't want to commit to this individual being him, even though he was like, yeah, that's me in that outfit. Okay, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly, like, when the mask was pulled up and the goggles were on, it was like, even though he's wearing the rest of the same outfit, he's like, oh, I can't quite tell. And that was very clear. Yeah. And the jury clearly agreed there that he.
The most common perjury line, but very hard to prosecute. I do not recall. And now, is this all, Ryan, sort of armchair analysis and online technology? Is there any sort of shoe leather work within a community of, hey, have you talked to anyone? It's actual kind of on the ground stuff.
I think like in the early days, there were some actions in terms of like, so one case we covered closely was this guy who assaulted officers with a pole, stormed the Capitol. And like, this ID was based off of the way that the sleuths found him, was that they got a facial recognition match for a courtroom image of him when he was charged with attempted first-degree murder. And he was out on bail on that charge. And so in that case, I believe the sleuths actually sort of reached out to the local prosecutor there and were like, hey, what's going on here? That case still took a lot of work to sort of get going. They ultimately didn't charge him until long after we'd already identified him in a story. But there were some matters where they sort of like, put some real light, like they entered into the fray a little bit more there. But I mean, there's like versions of shoe leather, I think, that are still digital shoe leather, where it's not just like
Right. Yeah.
like, this is blah, blah, blah. Like there's been a lot of work put into, how they went about this, but, they are largely just working, they're not really making calls to individuals. They're sort of presenting that. That's sort of when my role came in a lot of these cases.
Right.
It was like, yeah, here's all this info. And then I was the one in charge of like calling, right? And then I had to
Exactly.
to them and,
or even going to the 5 and dime. Okay, so let's just end here with where do things stand now with this loosely organized group of somewhat idiosyncratic individuals? The book's really interesting and just some of the personal portraits. But, they've made the biggest inroads in the case. What is there? Where do they now stand? Is there a role going forward, or is this basically now a, history?
No, there's definitely a bunch going forward, including on sentencing cases. Like there have been times where, they've been like the feds have reached out, right? Like they've like asked what's going on with this case. We want to make sure we've got, all of this before that, like, and they'll proactively do that sometimes where they're like someone's, going to be sentenced or something, or going to take a plea deal, and they'll just look into it and make sure that everything was covered. Because you'll still see affidavits come out now where it's very clear to me that the sleuths were not consulted, because they'll just have missed a bunch of stuff. Like they'll be like, oh yeah, we're charging this guy with, the misdemeanors, but like there's an assault or something in there that they missed, and that'll maybe be tacked on later. So I think, continuing to clear these out, there's still a bunch of people they want to ID. They, despite their enormous success, hundreds of cases of people who could be charged, including more than 100 on the FBI's list right now who the sleuths have already ID'd. So that means that, the Justice Department really is going to intended, at least at the beginning, to bring charges against those individuals. So there is a lot of work still ahead, and the clock is sort of ticking. So I think now it is more of this sort of pressure campaign almost to hold them accountable, to make sure that,
before the statute of limitations runs.
The clock doesn't run out on a lot of these cases, correct?
Yeah. The book is Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System. Ryan Reilly is the author. Really interesting, as well as an important part of the January 6th stories. Check it out. Ryan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.